Explain the following: the role of sodium ions in the generation of action potential, mechanism of generation of light-induced impulse in the retina, mechanism through which a sound produces a nerve impulse in the inner ear. So let us learn about this. So first, the role of sodium ions in the generation of action potential. So students, here sodium ions plays a very important role in the generation of action potential. That is, the charge difference across the membrane is maintained by the sodium ions and the potassium ions. When a nerve is at rest, the membrane is impermeable to sodium ions, and therefore outside the sodium ions are present more in number, and inside potassium ions will be more in number. Since the membrane is impermeable to sodium ions, the sodium ions remain outside and more potassium ions are present inside. So due to the difference in the potassium ions, the outside and inside, the potassium ion starts moving outside. So as a result, the concentration of positively charged ions is outside. So the outside of the membrane becomes positively charged when compared to inside. But when an electrical impulse is generated, an action potential is generated, the membrane becomes permeable to the sodium ions and the sodium ion channel opens, resulting in more of the sodium ions to enter inside. As more sodium ions enter inside, the inside cells becomes positively charged, generating an action potential. So to produce this action potential, sodium ions are required. So this polarization, the reversal of the polarity of the membrane, is called depolarization. So earlier the outside was positive and inside was negative, but when the action potential is generated due to change in the membrane permeability, now the inside became positive and outside became negative. So this is called depolarization. So sodium ions are responsible for the polarization, depolarization, and to generate the action potential. So let us learn the next part of the question, that is a mechanism of generating a light-induced impulse in the retina. So how the light-induced impulse is generated in the retina. So here we know that the innermost layer of the iris is retina. So it has got three regions. The first layer is the ganglion layer, the middle one is the bipolar layer, and the last one is the rods and cones, that is the photoreceptor layer. Now the nerve impulse is generated when the light reaches the photoreceptors. So photoreceptors are nothing but the cells, the rod cells and the cone cells. Now these cells have got proteins, the iodopsin and rhodopsin. So let us consider about the protein rhodopsin. Now this has got a protein called opsin and an aldehyde of vitamin called retinol. So here we can see this is an opsin and protein opsin and the vitamin, that is retinol. So both are present together. When the light ray fall on this protein, the retinol and opsin get separated. They will split. So this split changes the structure of the opsin. The opsin structure gets altered and this opsin becomes permeable for the ion channels. That means it causes the permeability of the membrane to change. So when the permeability of the membrane changes, positive ions enter inside more and a potential difference is generated. So this potential difference leads to the formation of action potential. That is, the depolarization takes place and an action potential is generated. So this action potential leads to the formation of nerve impulse. It has been transmitted from the bipolar neuron to ganglion neurons and from the ganglion neurons to the optic nerve fibers. And this optic nerve fibers carries the information to the brain and at the visual cortex of the brain. Now this visual cortex of the brain receives the impulses, analyzes, and the image is formed on the retina. So this is how the impulse is generated on the retina. So it mainly depends upon the protein present in the cone cells and the rod cells. So when this protein structure gets altered, it leads to the formation of action potential which will be transported. So let's move on to the next part of the question, that is the mechanism through which a sound produces a nerve impulse in the inner ear. In the previous question, we learned about the impulse generating in the retina. Now let's learn about the impulse produced in the inner ear. So first, here the information, that is the sound waves, are collected by the pinna. It is transmitted to the auditory canal and then to the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. So tympanic membrane is also called eardrum. The eardrum vibrates the sound waves and then it is conducted to the middle ear, that is ear ossicles. So these are the ear ossicles. From the eardrum, the information transfers to the ear ossicles, malleus, incus and stapes, and from here it is transmitted to the inner ear. So these ear ossicles transfer the sound waves to the internal ear. Now the vibration of the sound waves in the internal ear, that is the oval window and the fluid present in the cochlea, generates an action potential. So let us see how. So as there is a movement in the lymph, that is the fluid present in the cochlea, there is a vibration in the basilar membrane. So this cochlea has got a middle canal on which the basilar membrane is present. This is the basilar membrane, and on this basilar membrane there is an organ of Corti. So this organ of Corti consists of sensory cells called hair cells, and above this middle canal there is another canal called upper canal, through which there is a membrane arising. This membrane is called tectorial membrane. So when there is a movement in the fluid present in the basilar membrane, this leads to the changes in the hair cells. The hair cells get stimulated, they bend up, touching to the tectorial membrane. So when the tectorial membrane touches with the sensory hairs or the auditory hair cells, a nerve impulse, an action potential is being generated. There is a change in the permeability of the membrane. An action potential is being generated, and this action potential is being transported to the sensory neurons, and that is the auditory nerve. And the auditory nerve carries the information to the auditory cortex of the brain, and this part of the brain analyzes the nerve impulse and recognizes the sound. So this is a mechanism through which the sound produced or the sound which is received by the ear will be changed into the nerve impulse, and this changes happens in the sensory cells or the hair cells or the auditory hair cells which is present in the organ of Corti, and these changes generates electrical impulse which is carried by the auditory nerves. So these were the mechanisms what we have learnt: mechanism through which sound produces a nerve impulse in the inner ear, and a mechanism in which the light induced impulse which is generated in the retina is converted into the impulse, and the role of sodium ions in the generation of action potential.